my computer visible, Brenda?
It is, and I've begun
Okay.
recording.
All right. Well, again, thanks you all for attending this morning. I wanted to talk about the study we have investigating fire and plant and bird communities in the northern sedge meadows at SeNE and what we've learned over the project in working between research and land management biologists and the fire management. Just a quick overview of, we wanted to give you an idea of how we started on this project, what were the issues that brought me to SeNE and brought SeNE's interest to it, how we arrived at our study approach and our objectives, the actual application of the fire treatments, and then ultimately what we learned through this project, both from my perspective as a researcher and from Gary's perspective as a fire manager, and just a few ideas of where we might like to pursue from here. And as Brenda indicated earlier, please feel free to ask questions anytime online, and we'll try to answer them as we go through this. First, our interest is in this little secretive marsh bird called a yellow rail, which is very closely associated with open sedge meadows. These are usually shallowly flooded in spring, have a dense litter layer that provides yellow rails cover for nesting, foraging, and probably protection from predators. Water depths also seem to be a really important factor in their distribution. They usually like to be in water between 2 and 10 centimeters deep. Yellow rails have also been identified as a focal species of concern by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service migratory birds, and is also a species of concern in Canada, and is considered threatened in Michigan. There are also 2 other passerine species, the Conte Sparrow and the sedge wren, that are also associated with the same type of habitat, these sedge meadow systems, and are also considered focal species of concern because we really don't understand their populations, their numbers and distribution appear to be declining. So there's a lot of interest in how to manage their habitat and how they relate to their habitat, so we can then do habitat restoration and a better job of monitoring it. So we believe there's been habitat loss that's contributing to their population decline. Habitat loss of these sedge meadows either through altered hydrology, which is draining them to cultivate or hay those sedge meadows, potentially flooding them as other wetlands in the area are drained into them, become too deep for the species, and also fire suppression. Fire encourage sedges and grasses, of course, and helps to suppress woody growth. And in turn, with long-term fire suppression, we may get a lot more shrubs invading these open sedge meadows and potentially making them a lot less attractive or productive for yellow rails and other species. Birds in general respond to the habitat through vegetation structure, not so much by species, but primarily through the structure of that vegetation. And for yellow rails, again, the main drivers are water depths and litter layer, and they seem to be really tied to spine sedges, but we don't know if there's some threshold of that. We know that, or from some studies suggest that yellow rails are avoiding areas with shrub layers. We don't know if there's some threshold at which they avoid an area. And there's been a number of studies that describe habitat characteristics associated with rails, but they really weren't designed to try to evaluate a more complex aspect of vegetation and landscape structure, whether it's shrub patches or fragmentation of the habitat at a larger scale. Because of the role of fire and sedge meadows, again, we consider yellow rails and potentially the Lecontes and sedge wrens also as fire-dependent species, because we know that with burns, of course, immediately after that, you don't have that litter layer, and that may be really critical. But again, we don't know what the response time is after that fire for it making the habitat, again, attractive to the birds, or how often we need to be burning it to maintain that both open condition as well as ideal litter and water conditions. From the vegetative side, there's been a lot of studies, of course, in fire and sedge and shrub systems. Most of those appear to have involved dormant season burns during the early spring before trees and shrubs have leafed out very far, or in the fall. And, of course, results usually are just for 1 or 2 years after burning. They're not longer-term studies in many cases. And often the impact of burning appears to be quite short-lived. By 2 years after fire, we usually see a lot of vigorous suckering and new growth of shrubs. So you may have reduced the height of the stand, but not necessarily the density of the stand. Dormant season burns also can encourage species that are not tolerant for fire, so you may ultimately change your composition. Also, dormant season burns occurs when most of the nutrient reserves for the shrubs and other plants are below ground. So if you burn in a fall or spring dormant season, the plants have plenty of reserves to regrow. And so we suspect that dormant season burns aren't a solution for long-term suppression of shrubs. Summer burns, however, are occurring when most of the nutrient reserves are above ground. So if you take that out with fire, especially in the mid to late summer, the plants won't have time to reaccumulate nutrient reserves to get them ready for next spring's growth. Summer burns usually aren't conducted, however, for a whole variety of reasons, which I'm sure many of you in the fire world are familiar with. But we suspected if we could achieve good fires in the summer, we should have a much greater impact on fire suppression. So we started out with a number of questions. First was fire behavior, just how will fire carry during the peak growing season when everything is quite green. Fire effects. Will the growing season fires suppress shrubs better or longer than dormant season burns? And from the bird's perspective, how does the vegetation structure in those burns versus unburned areas compare to those used overall by focal species? Can the burned or unburned areas or dormant versus summer burns make a difference in that vegetation structure and in turn the response of species? You know, the primary purpose of fire, of course, is fuel hazards reduction. I guess I'll turn this over to Gary at this point to sort of explain from his perspective of the use of fire in these systems.
You know, our funding primarily is due hazard fuel reduction, and I know some of you have worked in these systems. And this photo, that's off the deck of a Marsh master, so that vegetation's like 7 feet high. It's kind of a, you know, we get the brush encroaches, we see it suppress the spread of fire until you get dry, and then we get this nasty fire that you can't work with. From like what we say up on the slide, from a community aspect, from a firefighter aspect, it's a lot friendlier to work a fire in an open sedge meadow than try to work a fire in this brush. So it lines up the species requirements, or the suite of species requirements, and what, you know, I'd like to see as a fire manager line up. Go ahead, Jane.
Yeah, well, Seney is long been known as a real hot spot for yellow rails. There's been some of the baseline research for understanding ecology and behavior of yellow rails has been conducted at Seney back in the 80s and in the 1970s, and at times we've had an incredible abundance of yellow rails in the area. This photograph was taken where we did detect yellow rails. One site a couple of years ago. You see that a lot of fine sedges, fairly sparse covering of shrubs, and it's a nice large open area. There have been a number of studies at, as I said, at Seney, and 2 of them were focused, most of them have been focused down at Marsh Creek in the southern side of the refuge, and the C3 unit, which is just to the east side of the wilderness area. And that's where we also focus much of our study, particularly the vegetation work. Peggy Berkman also worked on these 2 areas in a study back in the early 90s that looked at the effects of burnings on yellow rail use. But her 2-year study was challenged by ability to burn as their study plan desired. So she had a couple of her study blocks, they were simply not able to conduct the burn, so she was very limited in sample size, and therefore really limited in being able to say in these blocks whether or not yellow rails responded positively or how much, given the scale of her work and again the sample size she was limited by. So we've tried to learn from her approach and from other studies that have been out there to try to get a better way of addressing just what is the relationship between yellow rails and these other birds to fire and fire effects on vegetation. So our study approach had some challenges. First, that we've got a yellow rail, which is a very small secretive bird. It's actually smaller than a robin, that requires nocturnal surveys. So you have to work between 10 p.m. and about 6 a.m. to conduct nocturnal surveys. So it's very difficult to sample really broadly, as you would with other species. Also, their abundance can be highly variable from year to year, so it's tough to rely on presence-absence just on a few study blocks, unless they're extremely large. So we needed multiple sites to detect yellow rails. And we also knew that fire studies are pretty notorious, that you have this lovely study design, and you go out into the field, and well, you either don't get burned, or it burns accidentally, or something else comes up, and the ideal conditions you had hoped for in your study plan didn't come through. So we wanted to make sure that we could build in some flexibility in our study to be able to still come out with some useful results. So again, our core question is, how does fire affect vegetation structure? And in terms, how do birds relate to that fire structure and to the fire history of those sites? So we developed a study that had two parallel components. One where one component we focused on the vegetation and its response to prescribed burning on intensively sampled sites at Marsh Creek and C3. And then we also conducted bird surveys both in and around those study sites, as well as much more broadly across the refuge, to examine their response to vegetation structure, also knowing their fire history. And in both sites we collected habitat metrics that were very comparable. Our study objectives, again reflecting those components, to evaluate the effects of prescribed burning on the plant community, cover, and structure, and to describe the occurrence and distribution of yellow rails and relate those habitat characteristics, relate their distribution to habitat characteristics and fire history, and also to describe the occurrence and distribution of Conte Sparrow, sedge wrens, and some other birds in these habitats, to habitat characteristics, again, fire histories along those sites. Again, we're trying to say we've got equivalent metrics in the vegetation component and the bird component, that hopefully we can ensure reasonable sample sizes in both, but also be able to cross between those two scales. So we also learned from, I'll go back a minute, we also had learned from a previous study at Grays Lake on where I had worked with a botanist in terms of the study design, again, where we investigated the effects of fall burning, as well as some other management practices on nesting waterbirds, small mammals, and plants. And that study has helped provide a template on how to design this one. So in 2006, we had a pilot year just to figure out what could we do on yellow rails, what was the distribution, get familiar with the area, and really spend some time in dialogue with Dave Olson, the refuge biologist at the time, and with Gary to say, these are the questions of interest, just how can we get at them, what's going to be feasible. Well, 2006 happened to be a really dry year. We had extremely few rails. I think we finally detected 3 in July, far past the normal breeding season. And so we realized that some of our ideas were just not going to work. And so we had to go back to the drawing board and get a handle of what was up. So we spent a lot of time surveying, getting familiar with the areas. We also spent a lot of time in the field with Gary and Dave, often in the back of a marsh master, to get away from the roads and the standard pool areas, to get a much better sense of what the bird program was at CNE, how fire management was part of the system, and what the questions were of the refuge. And we spent a lot of time just discussing, how do we get to our core questions of interest on both vegetation and birds. So ultimately, we worked very collaboratively through a lot of discussions to figure out just how to put this study together. And we also had an opportunity to test the basic sampling concept we came up with in July with fire logistics in a place near Pine Creek. And some of those questions, for instance, how do we prevent a fire from burning into a control block that's logistically feasible for Gary and his crew when it's part of a larger scheduled burn? Yes, please do.
I believe that was also at the time when we discovered that at certain water levels, by merely looking at the block, it wouldn't burn. Were you referring to where we did that test block?
Right, yeah, that was a challenging one.
That the collecting the veg data with higher water levels, and the block wouldn't burn. Through the fire lines, were the humans looking at it, compacted the litter, the vegetation into the water, and and we wanted to burn that block, and it wouldn't burn.
Yeah.
You chose to kind of watch that, and you know, your blocks were put in a little bit drier sites, correct?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, it looked really ideal for some things, and it was actually in one of the areas where we had heard yellow rails in 2006, that same year, but turned out to be a little bit too wet for accomplishing anything, even in that dry year. So our final study approach was to conduct bird surveys across the refuge, as indicated by the small numbers and some of the line transects there, and really focus our vegetation structure work at C3 and at Marsh Creek. Both areas, again, have long histories of yellow rail abundance and studies, as well as the recent prescribed burning activities, so we have a good sense of the fire histories. Marsh Creek has the longest history of both fire and yellow rail studies, and both C3 and Marsh Creek were burned in 1976 when the big fire took out pretty large chunks of the region. Parts of Marsh Creek were also burned in 1983. An attempt was made to burn C3 in 2003, which is a very patchy burn, and a lot of the areas we were working in really didn't carry a fire. So we set up in each area, C3 and in Marsh Creek, we set up a set of paired blocks, one burn, one control, paired sites on these two historical areas in August and September 2006. Laid out bird survey areas to overlap those vegetation blocks, as well as covering these larger areas across the refuge. And we collected our first data on vegetation in late August, September 2006, which also helped us to work out more sampling details, such as getting the data sheets to work, establishing a better plant lists and voucher specimens to know what we're working with, and to better refine our written protocols so over the next several years people could do it reasonably consistently. This is an example of how we marked our sites. This is one of our control blocks in the northwestern corner of C3. We've marked them with tall poplar poles, in part because everywhere we went out in the marsh we kept finding steel T-posts that we didn't know who had left them behind. So we wanted something that would last for, 3 to 5 years, but in time would not become just more human marks on the landscape. Anyway, we collected, set up the sites in 2006 for the pilot data in that year, and then we also collected vegetation data and bird data in 2007, 2008, and 2009. And we also collected the last year vegetation data this year. We planned for a summer burn in Marsh Creek in summer of 2007, and in C3 we planned on a May burn in 2008 with the expectation of burning again in the summer in 2009 or 2010. And Gary, if you explain why we chose a May burn for C3.
C3, a lot of it is got a very heavy brush component to it. And the first burn we tried it in 2003, it became real obvious the brush was so heavy, even where there was dead fuel under the brush that you would think would carry great. It trapped the nighttime dewfall and moisture when there was full leaf out on the brush, and there was a very narrow window. It would take a pretty dry conditions to burn at the dry conditions at the edge of controllability. So what we decided to do after talking to a lot of different folks was go in and do a spring burn before the foliage was on, so we could capture a little bit more moderate conditions to get our fire to spread, and top kill the older big brush, and then come back in with a summer burn when we didn't have that heavy overstory. We didn't visualize we were pushing the brush off the landscape, but we were visualized setting up to do a burn when we could have longer-term impact to the brush.
Right. So this is a map of the C3 area, the pink colors are actually our sedge blue joint cover types. We were very fortunate that Steny had done an excellent veg mapping work that took the plant alliances down to lower level. So, for instance, the really pale pink, I think, is probably 90% sedge blue joint cover, and anything in white is upland. Green, I think, is probably cattail areas. Anything in the red are darker colors are denser shrub covers. These show the paired blocks, where we have burn and control blocks sort of paired relative to what we think would be the subsurface flow of water distance from the dike, and we try to arrange all of these blocks in both of the two study areas from a range of very open high sedge blue joint cover to increasing covers of woody cover. And for instance, C3 and C3, 7, and 8 down in the lower part of the screen, where we had the control and burn blocks, were some of our heaviest shrub cover by far, and then we had areas that were a different mix. At Marsh Creek, similar layout of blocks. The ones outlined in black were the ones to be burned. Studies, again, pink and more of the yellow rails and sedge wrens, but also, although it doesn't show it quite so much in this cover type, that we still had a range of shrub cover, including a lot of leatherleaf, but also tag alder, bog birch. Especially at Marsh Creek, we had a lot more leatherleaf that probably didn't pop up as well in the cover types. The basic layout of our block design was something so large enough we could get replicate samples within it, but also small enough that if need be you could run a hose around it, and it would have reasonably normal fire behavior to carry through it. So we had a block that was total of 150 by 150 meters, systematically laid out, 25 sampling points within that along 5 transects, and we surrounded the whole thing with a buffer area of another 25 meters, so it was heavily marked with, or the corners were marked with very large poplar poles with a ton of flagging during the burn years, so the fire crew and others out there would not walk through the plot accidentally and impact any of the vegetation. At each point we collected a variety of data on plant cover, which we did down 2 species, including down to sedge species, shrub cover in several different ways, and patch size, which is a horizontal measure of plant cover, and also vertical structure using a standard 6-meter tall cover board. 3-meter tall cover board. Won't go into those details here, but we can certainly talk a little bit more about our plant sampling if folks are interested. So then we get to the actual application of fire. So as said in the past, fire studies don't always go off as we have in the study plan. 2007, we planned to burn all of Marsh Creek, cover all of those burn blocks, but it was a Category 5 nationally. Those who were in the area knew that there were drought conditions locally, and a quote from one of the local weather citations of Newberry, which is about 40 miles away, experienced its drier May 1 to July 31 period in the 96 years of record keeping. So we were at 50% of normal, soil moisture percentiles less than 30% of normal across most of upper Michigan. So truly extreme drought. Again, not a lot of rails around. And Gary was able to burn 1 block at Marsh Creek and conducted a second test burn near the second burn block and terminated efforts. We'll go into those details in a little bit with some more photographs. And then the Sleeper Lake fire started about 3 weeks later, and that was it for the region. In May 2008, we did conduct the spring birds on the C3 blocks in that whole area. And we had fairly moderate water conditions on the site at the time. And in July 2008, we were able to complete burn on the remaining area of C3 blocks, including those 3 burn blocks that were embedded in there, although the conditions were certainly wetter than that in 2007. Again, we had planned to return to C3 to do a follow-up burn, but that in this year, 2010, but this proved to be the wettest summer on record, so that didn't happen as hoped for. Now, these are the conditions during our 2 attempted burn, one burn and 1 attempted burn in 2007, where we did the 1 block on the 17th of July, and then the test burns trying to continue burning on a 2nd block on the 20th of July. Gary, if you want to talk about the patterns here.
You know, this was we were drying down at this point. We could still operate, but it was becoming obvious that if we didn't get rain, things were going to get to the point where we couldn't do business safely with RX. The 2nd burn was further, almost a half-mile away from the dike, and it is in a site that's normally a little drier. We ignited it. Things were going okay. We had 2, minor, the size of your boot spots, and we're sitting and watching, and this is at 10 o'clock in the morning, and the fire would back up to willow, and the willow would torch. And I don't mean it would preheated in torch. It would burn pretty much like you sprayed it with kerosene. And we watched for about 15 minutes and thought the better part of valor was to shut the burn down. We just, at that point, we made the decision we're not going to do any more RX until we get different conditions. And we were looking at, a pretty wide area of the refuge at that point, and writing was on the wall. We were set up for a major fire event.
Yeah. So this is the burn at Marsh Creek 2 on the 17th of July. I can't remember how many acres that was. Gary, if you want to talk about a little bit more about the burn specifically here and how the behavior was.
This was just a great burn. The soil moisture was high enough that a marsh master could, drive, make a pass, hold the vegetation over with the tracks, without major rutting, and it was moist enough that with a little bit of effort with a fire swatter and a booster line, you had a nice fire line. The fire would back evenly, and we had full consumption of the leaves on the brush. The brush would torch, burn, just beautiful burning conditions. You were at that edge where if you had a spot, you could deal with it, but if you're used to our swamps up here, just imagine 9:30 in the morning, your fire will back. That was the conditions we had.
Yeah. And the results 10 days after the burn? Pretty much scorched most of the shrubs. A lot of the litter removed, including at least a year-old litter. Most of the sphagnum moss also was scorched, and some of it outright killed.
And I think, Jane, that's an example of the fire did not get to that brush, but there was enough heat to kill it, because that was a clump of sphagnum, correct?
Yeah, in that particular case, yeah. We had others where it clearly got under the shrubs because there was enough fine litter to really take it, get a harder burn. 1 year later, you can see that's a meter stick there. You can see the shrubs, of course, resprouting, but the difference in the vegetative cover between the two, right along the fire line there. Then we were in September 2006, 2007, sort of showing the same area. So 2006 was the year before the burn, September, about 2 months after the burn. and then one photo point about in the same area in 2008 and then in 2010. I noticed you can see some trails there in both of those photographs, and again, we'll talk about that. One of the challenges of our data collection towards the end of this, one of it's part of our lessons learned. And some photographs of the test burn, where we had some very significant ashing right down to through the peat in places, and some torching of the shrubs. Well, it was about an acre that you burned there?
Half acre.
Half acre.
But we didn't have a ground fire start there. It wasn't that dry.
Yeah. Definitely removed a lot of the litter though on that one. And we also should mention that you're using the Marsh Master to lay down the fire line along the edge, but there was insufficient moisture, even especially going through the leather leaf. It pumped right back up, and you couldn't even tell where the Marsh Master had gone through.
We were dependent on spraying it out with the booster line.
Yeah. 2008 was certainly wetter conditions. Again, fire conditions at C3 early in May, and then in July back at Marsh Creek to finish burning that. For those who are familiar with these graphics from Minnesota DNR website. Michigan. Excuse me. The C3 burn was an aerial photograph after the burn. You can see two of the control boxes embedded within the larger burn area, and the first one on the lower part on our western edge of the area that we took the fire around for convenience. And you can also see the fire was pretty patchy on the south end of that area, and you couldn't even see where the fire really didn't get through the block number 8 there, which we had planned to burn, and it just sort of burned up, sort of close to that block, and we certainly didn't have to worry too much about the control block. The fire was just not carrying in this area, which had the heaviest shrub cover. Further comments, Gary?
It wasn't a real wet spring, but your boots were wet on this burn. And by the time you got to the south end, the water was up over your ankles. But fire, we were very happy. We got fire to carry where we never had fire to carry before. And carry during the summer, short of kind of those post-apocalyptic or world-ending fire events.
A few photographs of the fire. You had 1 to 3 foot flame lengths burning through sedge grass litter and old cattail residue. Of course, you can see it's greening up already, but carrying pretty well. Shrubs were torching. This is from the levee, but we had some good torching of shrubs in some areas, especially where we had good litter, 2 to 4 foot flame lengths. Post-fire, this is along that control edge, along the west edge, so our control plot. You can see a little bit of flagging there on the outside of our control block where they avoided it, and then the main edge of the burn, you can see that fire carried through there pretty well, but left a lot of litter really unburned. Oops, excuse me. The consumption of litter was pretty patchy. We did scorch a lot of the shrubs, especially the shorter tamaracks. Really got hit pretty hard. Tag alder and bog birch, and a lot of times they got pretty well scalded, so they were peeling afterwards. But again, pretty patchy burn of some of the damper litter. And as we got into the shrubbier areas to the south, where you really did have heavy shrub cover, you can see that the fire just it was not carrying, and certainly not hot enough to really make a dent in those heavy areas in the south. This is a photograph on the edge of our control block in one of the woodier areas. The way that Gary's crew sought to prevent fire from entering the control block was to use, went out and chainsawed the area and removed the down shrubs, and then ran the Marsh Master around it enough to really wet down the area. It turned out we didn't need it down here, certainly because it was a bit too wet for the fire to carry. but it certainly proved to be an effective way, even in the shrub area, to prevent fire from spreading.
You know, one of the reasons we did the chainsawing was so that the marsh master would even be on the ground. The brush was so heavy, and that it delineated where the block was. You had trouble seeing where the flagging was.
Yeah, this particular area is really tough to work in for bird surveys or even vegetation work at times to see more than 10 feet. And we suspect, in looking at the age and girth of the shrubs down here, it probably has not carried a fire since the '76 fire. So by August 2010, we definitely have pretty healthy regrowth of shrubs in many cases, but still have a lot of dead stems showing up. Marsh Creek, mid-July, started off with much better, wetter conditions, of course, than 2007. Gary, if you want to comment about the conditions for this burn?
2007, you drive is boots dry. This 2008, your boots were wet. There was obviously standing water. We had good fire behavior on this day, but what we had happen was the Lake Michigan sea breeze and the lake effect winds off of Lake Superior collided in the area around the burn unit. We started off, that wasn't necessarily forecast, we started off with a steady wind that deteriorated to a wind that was coming from around the clock and died off on us. So a lot of this burned hot, burned well, and then we had areas that just, we couldn't make it happen due to a lack of wind, and we had some cloud cover built in.
Yeah. This is about midway through the burn. And you can see a few poplar poles on either side of the person out there. Gary?
Well, midway, this is right off the dike, Jane. This is just starting. There's midway.
Yeah.
At least that's what I see on my computer.
Yeah.
This is midpoint, yeah.
This is the midpoint, yeah.
And the fire was doing great.
When you get closer to some of the other areas, it was carrying through some of the greener vegetation, like maybe 1 foot flame heights. Certainly was not carrying all that far. In some areas, here you see some little patchier burns near one of our block, Marsh Creek 4, that was supposed to burn, and just pretty patchy despite a lot of efforts of throwing fire at it.
Jane, we have a question from Steve Schumacher.
Yeah.
He's asking, in growing season burns, the litter load is what allows the fire to overcome the green fuel load. How many growing seasons post-summer burn before you could do another summer burn? And Steve, I'm actually going to unmute you, and that way you can discuss it. So we can hear you now.
Gary, you want to take that on?
Hey, Steve. The answer, I can give you a simple answer. I have successfully burned 1 year post-fire. The problem is it has to do your water levels. When I first got here in 2002, I walked down in this country when the water was similar to right there in a pair of tennis shoes and stayed dry. There was 4 inches of litter on the ground. We came back the next year to burn. We had a ½ inch of litter on the ground. The water we'd had several big thunderstorms. The water built up down here. It just freakishly stayed in June. It decayed my litter. So it's a mixture. You can burn after 1 year if the water doesn't take your litter away. 2 years, you're great.
Thank you, Gary. Steve, does that answer your question, Steve Schumacher? And his audio might not be connecting. So Steve, if that's not the answer you were, or if you have another question, feel free to type it in. I see that you don't have a mic, Steve, so we'll go ahead and go forward. Thank you, Gary.
Yep. Yeah, and clearly, as one of the lessons learned, I certainly learned, and Gary has learned over his career, I guess, is that important interaction between water conditions, not only in the year and the week you're burning, but also in preceding conditions. So, aerial photograph, ultimately, of how well the burn at Marsh Creek was conducted. To the left on the screen was where the 2007 burn was done, so we don't show that, but this is the extent of the 2008 burn in July. You can delineated where the burn and control blocks were. You can see so we're about in the middle. That one burn block didn't burn much at all, except a little bit on the edge. The other two blocks that were assigned to be burned, most of it did burn pretty well. A little patchy, but overall seemed to have a good burn, and control blocks overall worked pretty well. But there was sort of that central area, or just not able to carry a fire through that.
And that's true. That is clear from knowing this site really well. This is where it didn't burn is linked to water levels.
And also, this slide also, I think, points out a really interesting pattern. Right square in the middle, you see sort of a more of a fluorescent green shape just north of, let's see, I guess the middle burn block, and just above it is obviously some pine island with some trees, and on the north side of that is a fairly bright but grassy green area. And a lot of these pine islands will prevent water from, that's flowing from the dike on the top of your screen up here down towards the south, or we suspect down in this direction. Water appears to be accumulating behind these pine islands, and probably has one of the major factors, just slight changes in hydrology and wet conditions on the upflow side of the pine islands will be a lot less likely to be able to carry fire than on some of these other areas away from the pine islands that the water flow is unimpeded, and therefore probably lower conditions, lower moisture conditions. So, and by August 2008, this is what the burn block in number 5 looked like. Pretty well scorched off. The trees took off a fair bit of the litter in this particular area. You can also see a little bit of remnants of the trail there where the fire didn't carry.
Jane.
Yes.
I don't know if you realize that there's a 15-second time lag on the slide change.
Oh. That's interesting. Okay.
Or at least that's what's starting to happen.
Okay, thank you.
Well.
Yeah. So again, photograph in August 2008 when it did burn. To that part of the area, there's still a few green patches there. And then similar area, about the same place at Marsh Creek Tree at our photo point. And this year, I still see definitely pick out a lot of hydra shrubs, dead stems, but leatherleaf and the potentilla there, the yellow on the screen, seems to be pretty healthy, but we have a really nice thick growth and tall stand of sedges and grasses there. On to lessons learned from the fire. I'm not going to get into results because they're really preliminary at this point, but we wanted mainly to focus on what we've learned here and from each of our perspectives. One of the main things that I have learned, particularly in spending a lot of time talking with Gary and watching the fires as they were during the prescriptions, that a researcher really needs to learn and understand the language of fire. Fire hazards versus risk, burn severity versus intensity, and the overall language of fire and fire management and operations, as opposed to how we as researchers perceive it more in the fire ecology end. It's it's really necessary how we communicate with those fire managers, and also making sure that we're going to provide them meaningful results with the right terminology, that it works for both sides. As a researcher, I also had to learn a lot about fire behavior, what it really means to the outcome. Finally got what it means, that why you care about flame length and rate of spread, and what this means ultimately to fire operations, and applying what we desire as a researcher for a study to apply that in the field. We also have to appreciate what are the appropriate metrics of fire and its impacts out there, how we need to design our study for that. Again, so we both the researcher and the fire manager has something they can work with and understand in their own worlds. And one of the things that, I've been interested in fire ecology for probably 5 or 7 years now, and it's really frustrating as I've learned more about it, that usually, even on the wonderful studies they do at Conte Sparrow on grassland studies, grassland fires there, they may, if you're lucky, report the date, or there was sometime in May, but they almost never talk about fire behavior, what the fire weather was, or any other more detailed information of just what was the conditions immediately before the burn in terms of the substrate, especially in wetlands, what the water conditions were. You really don't have a sense of immediately after the burn, what did it look like, what was the burn severity, what were the metrics of fire behavior. You just simply say a burn was conducted in May, and that's it. I think we really need, as fire ecologists, to be doing a much better job of providing that information for a better interpretation of our data. And as mentioned frequently earlier, water conditions are critical to understanding burning in these wet meadows as well as any wetland. Not only the interaction between water and litter the year of burning, but also water and litter in past years, of how that affects the decomposition and availability of litter for fine fuels, and ultimately how do those water conditions before, during, and after affect the opportunities for plants and how they're going to respond to burning. And of course, simply the realities of fire management. You have a very different focus, especially hazard fuels and WUI, whereas we have issues of experimental design working hopefully together towards something that's really a much more adaptive management approach that is useful to both sides. And by understanding the realities of what you as fire managers are dealing with, we can better integrate our study design into your fire operations and your logistics, what really can be done out there, and at what scale, and also perhaps at what time of year and under what water or fire conditions. One was we knew this was going to happen because we saw a little bit of it at Grays Lake, although when we were sampling at Grays Lake, it was usually quite dry in most conditions. Most of the years sampling at Seney until 2010, by the time the vegetation sampling was done, your boots were dry. In fact, you could sit down and the seat of your pants wouldn't get wet. But still, we had some really significant impact of trampling along those transects and near the points where we're doing our line transect cover measurements to get plant species cover. You're walking on litter, which is lofted above the peat. You've got really soft substrate where you can readily create trails, just like the game trails out there, that you're compressing that litter and the older litter that's now decomposing into peat down into the moisture, if not into standing water. Our impact was probably huge this year in 2010. The botanist working for me said that she was measuring litter underwater, so we still have some measure of it, but all of that, of course, is going to have a whole different range of decomposition, and anything that was just shallowly damp or flooded in previous years and it got wet because we walked on it, it's going to decompose much faster than litter that stayed dry during the end of the summer. So it's really a challenge on how to collect data that is sort of replicated across years while minimizing the impact on those data in later years, and how long does it take for those areas to recover, and also what is the impact of those areas that now can't carry a fire and clearly become fire barriers under some fire conditions. It may take a lot more to try to burn, get your fire to spread across those trails that we've created by sampling or just by walking through an area. Gary, forgive me, we didn't get that inserted. Your point?
Can you give me just a second then?
Yeah, pull them up.
One thing, without going to my points here, what we found when we started doing this study was problems with stumbling into the blocks. Jane, and in our talks, Jane designed in that buffer area around the blocks, and that was wonderful. It gave us room. If we were going to have to protect it with a hose lay and well points, we had room to work. We, without altering the actual site where the work was being done. We also had to put, to be successful, anybody that was, say, operating like at that squad boss level, running a Marsh master, had each one of the blocks. We built a GPS, a file for the Garmin GPS that had all the blocks in it on a simple topo map. So at any given time, that person could look up and know what block they were next to, where they were inside of it or outside of it. We had no equipment run through a block. We didn't have any weird fire patterns or that messed up the design. I don't know if I've got, with this study, the conversations between Mr. Olson and Jane and I started early on in the design phase, and compared to some of the other projects I've been involved over the past 20 years, it was really neat because I didn't end up with a project to support Jane. I didn't have to go drop $20,000 on new equipment. I didn't have to do major knee jerks to do a burn that was successful for Jane. Jane's project fit in with what we were already doing, and all our efforts directly supported the mission we were funded to do. And it really went hand in hand. I've been involved in some others where there's no communication up front, and you got a nightmare. Jane, you got anything to say along those lines?
I guess you also, one of the other points that we've discussed is the issue of being able to tap into experts. You know, as a waterbird biologist with an interest in fire ecology, I'm still learning. Being able to tap into your expertise, Zeke's expertise, and other professionals in the wildland fire community who understand fire behavior, some of the fire models, and what will it take to work. We really need to be spending a lot more time talking up front and involving and reaching out to those other experts to get them involved, especially if we want to get involved with fire behavior models. Just beginning to realize that is a huge area that takes someone like Zeke to really do it appropriately. It's not something you pick up readily. And if you want a grad student involved to do measures in the field that are going to be, again, appropriate for what a fire manager needs to understand to apply that research, those research findings. They need to be trained, and as does the researcher, to understand how is that, say, fuel loading measured operationally as opposed to research, and make sure that they are complementary at the very least, so you can translate one to the other. And ultimately, by involving the experts, we're going to have, on both sides, a lot better credibility, better publications, I hope, that not only are useful to the fire ecology world, but also to the fire management applications.
But to do justice on the level of communication, I mean, the study had an excellent design. The projects had excellent design to it. But because of the environmental conditions we ran into, we had to morph things. And more than one time, time, I found myself standing on top of a marsh master trying to figure out what went where. And this is not during a fire. This is when we're trying to demarcate plots and wrap our heads around how we can pull this off. And I'm talking to Jane on the cell phone, and she's in North Dakota, and that level of communication made the difference between this being successful and not being successful. Especially when we ran up to a national planning level 5 in the wildfire world, and the question is, do we have to burn all the blocks down at Marsh Creek, or do we just burn one? Those conversations were happening ahead of time.
So I guess if you have any questions from the audience.
We do have a few if you're ready to take those.
Yeah, a good time.
Okay, one I've got from Roger Jones. He's asking, is summer burning of the shrubs that much more effective at controlling them as opposed to a spring burn timed to the initial leaf flush, basically a mid to late May time frame? And Roger doesn't have a microphone.
Hey, from the standpoint of this study, again, we don't have the results in yet. My sense is that given the conditions that we had, if we'd had conditions like in 2007 and been able to burn more, we might have seen more consistent results. But at this point, I'm seeing pretty variable results, and that's as far as I can say. But Gary, based on your experience?
Once active growth has started, it's pretty easy to at least top kill the brush. What gets slippery and what not much work has been done in is, let's see to say, the better the site is for that brush, the longer it's been there, the harder it is to truly kill it. So, we might go down to Marsh Creek and you've got a patch of brush, you hit with fire, it's gone. And I mean a little 10 by 10. 50 yards away, you got a patch that you keep hitting, and it won't go away. There's nuances of the site that prevent me from saying that, May is bad. May be great where you are with the conditions you've got. It's growing season. This is anecdotal, but the gentleman that does some fuels work for us, mechanical, has been doing power line right-of-way stuff and has worked in many wetlands. His equipment's set up to do it. He'll tell you real quick, summer, late summer, August, best time. And he's been doing it for 30 years. And he says that whether it's fire, herbicide, or mechanical. I wouldn't throw May and June out, though.
From a standpoint of thinking about how a plant functions, if you can hit it at a time where it just can't recoup, it can't put the nutrients back in the ground in time for the fall senescence, and the next spring it's struggling to use what limited stuff it has. If you can do that on a repeated level, in theory, we should be able to be more successful at setting back shrubs or suppressing them. But one of the questions then remains is, how often do you have to do it? Again, probably site conditions. If you've got the heavy shrub cover, as we saw on the south side of C3, hasn't been burned probably since ’76, they've got a huge root system. It may take a lot more work to really kill them or get conditions to get the fire to kill the crown, the growing points on the shrubs.
Okay, do you want me to go on to the next question? Or?
Sure.
Okay, this one's from Wade Hawes, and he's asking, did you encounter ragweed in your meadow habitats, and how was it handled? Consecutive burns, spraying, etc.?
No, I don't believe we had any ragweed.
Jane, C3, don't we have a wetland ragweed down in there?
Oh,
It's
I'm
out
dealing mostly
more on the south
with,
end, and
yeah.
no means have we controlled it.
I don't say we've controlled it. Again,
What's the target?
Excuse me?
That wasn't the target down there.
No. We don't. We have very few invasives in this system, fortunately. We did find this year some scattered patches of marsh thistle, which is considered an invasive in the Northeast, and we may keep an eye on that, although it is shown to be throughout the UP and some of the other lake states. But we generally had very few species in the wetland that we would consider noxious or invasive species, and we're certainly not looking at controlling in that standpoint.
And the species I'm referring to was native.
Okay.
And I can't tell you the Latin, the common. Somebody was referring to it as a ragweed that grows in wetlands.
Give me the scientific name, I might remember, because
I don't have
it's working that way primarily. So, other questions?
Yes, from Walt Gessler. Did you have any available information on what the historical fire return interval was in these plant communities?
We have the fire histories from Scenic Refuge files. The only fire return interval information is really from the upland work by Charles Grobel. And that's one of the big questions I certainly have as a person interested in wetlands. How do you get at an understanding of what fire frequency is in the wetland systems themselves?
And something that's wild in this system, from a person trying to apply a prescribed burns, it's pretty easy to find a day when you can go out and burn healthy sedge meadow. Finding a day that burns healthy sedge meadow and the pine uplands is, meets your objectives, gets much harder. It can rain at 8 in the morning. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a healthy sedge meadow, if it's dried out and the RH, you know, if the sun comes out and the RH drops to 60, 55%, there's a little wind, very likely burn that sedge meadow. From the people I've been working with in this system here, a lot of us feel that we had fires burning in the sedge meadows that never were getting on the pine islands. And that's due to water pooling around the pine islands, we're thinking, brush around them. So it's a sticky wicket when we get into historical fire returns.
Okay, thank you, Walt. And I believe we have one last question left, and this is from Patrick Brown. And he is asking, are there any places that burned in 2007 that could be studied? I wonder what the difference is when conditions support intense fires versus the conditions that we usually burn in.
Well, certainly there's a huge study area at Sleeper Lake with the intense burn there, and I'm sure there's folks on the line that were involved with that fire, including Gary.
I'd say it's, you know, what the question gets is, what do you want to study? You know, what in what kind of site do you want to look at? There's all kinds of stuff from 2007.
One of the challenges is coming up with comparison sites, and the lack of pre-burn data is often the case. Go ahead.
I see that Walt Gessler still has his hand up. I'm going to unmute you for a second, Walt. Did you have another question, or was that continuing on your other one? And Walt, you might not have a mic as well. I'm thinking that might be the case. Okay. I think that's about it then.
Well, just to take it a little bit further, we've had some ideas of, Gary and I have had a lot of ideas, and we'll have raised a lot of questions in this work that we'd like to pursue if opportunities arise. And one of them, again, is that heavy shrub areas down, like we saw down in the southwest portion of C3. what would it take to really convert that to more open sedge meadows? And so I've been thinking that, again, the area has some of the heaviest and tallest shrub cover with a lot of even like speedy species, like a lot more goldenrod and sedges. And based on refuge records, it hasn't been burned since the Walsh 6, so more than 30 years ago. Shrub conditions are very tall, and some of these are 20 plus feet tall. They're really limiting the development and curing of the fire fuels. Shrubs and trees, we uncertain approached into the area due to that burn. We need to go back to some of the historical photographs to see how much shrub cover was there. And the overall question is this a plant community and substrate system that we could actually reset through management back to a more open sedge meadow that would be appropriate for species like yellow rails and birds. So we're proposing, just sort of a truly adaptive management approach over the long term, similar to what we use for controlling the fire from spreading to that area, is by just going in and chainsawing woody growth in half of our existing blocks where we have the pre-existing plant data and shrub data in the summer or fall, just chainsawing it down, letting that woody material cure and allow the graminoids and the pine fuels to develop for at least a year, and the woody material to get ready. Burn again in the summer as possible in order to have a good hot fire, and then continue to repeat that chainsaw burn cycle until you can actually suppress or kill out those older shrubs. And it may take several cycles of that. And then just develop a simple monitoring protocol that 2 people could go out there for a relatively modest amount of time every summer and look at shrub cover and cover board every year to see how the impact is going. That's something we'd like to approach if there's some resources and time available to see if we can really reset an area that's heavily shrubbed to something more open in the long term. But related to that is sort of the larger question. In the literature I keep reading that woody cover encroaches into open sedge meadows, but there's not that many places that I'm aware of that we've actually have documentation on that at a landscape scale. So looking at the greater Manistee Swamp, can we actually document that encroachment of woody cover, whether it's shrubs or tamarack and spruce and the like, actually encroaching into our open sedge meadows and indeed causing substantial habitat loss to species like yellow rails. Again, we're interested in this because there's a lot of birds and plant species, including some endangered ones, endangered plant or threatened plant species that are associated with these more open meadows, seem to be declining in abundance or shrinking in their distribution and their range of habitats. And this also may be really of interest to climate change issues. If we're changing our temperatures and hydrology, are those conditions enhancing the conditions for greater shrub encroachment into these open areas? We also know, particularly throughout Sini, but also in other parts of the greater Manistee Swamp, there's a history of extensive ditching in the region for logging or intensive cultivation, which have probably enhanced opportunities for shrubs to creep into the area, and certainly have had fire suppression for many years in the region. So if we'd like to find some resources to get some aerial imagery and using GIS remote sensing techniques and more recent wetland classification data to actually assess what has been the change in vegetative cover in these wet areas and the impact of drainage across the greater Manistee Swamp. So again, the 2 things we'd like to pursue, as well as some other ideas that are kicking around, and we certainly look to our folks in the Fire Consortium if they have some ideas or ways that we could perhaps bring these ideas into action. Finally, I guess that's the end of our presentation. Again, if there's any other questions you want to give online, or Gary and I would certainly be open if you want to email us to pursue anything further.
Jane, the ragweed?
Yeah.
Not ragweed, it was goldenrod.
Oh, yeah.
Walked around in my head.
Yeah, we had goldenrod. I don't remember a ragweed. We have Cirsium species, but I don't think ragweed in the way that person was indicating. So.
And I'm not seeing any more questions coming in at the time.
I think we got one, Michael Peterson.
Oh. Michael, you've got your hand raised, but I don't have you on the audio. Can you type in the question to me? Yes, I'm sorry, Michael Peterson. If you wanted to type in a question, we could take it that way, but I don't have you listed under audio, so I'm unable to have you just ask the question at this time.
We can catch up with Mike later.
Okay.
Patrick Brown seems to have a question.
Patrick Brown actually wanted to let everybody know, let Jane and Gary know that you did a nice job. So nice job, Jane and Gary.
All right. Thanks, Pat. Again, appreciate the time for everyone who listened in, and again, we continue to be really interested in the issue of burning these systems. So if we hope we can generate some more interest in burning in wetlands, and be happy to talk with anybody about it further.
Oh, I do have one more quick question from you from Dave Pergolski. He's just got a quick one about how many extra personnel did it take to keep fire out of controls?
Out of the controls, C3, I think we had 5 extra people. In Marsh Creek, we had no extra people. That's part of the magic of this, is working with Jane. We were able to design things that and orchestrate it so it wasn't a cost increase to the burn.
Yeah, I think you might have had a pair of people going out maybe a week early or a day early to work on the buffer,
Oh yeah,
the area around the buffer zones. But during the fire, you had a lot of people on the C3 burn, as I recall.
but that was spring cured, and we wanted to keep it right in the box, and they weren't so much there to keep it out of the control plots. It was all time. We were able to time it so you didn't have 3 or 4 people standing on each control plot.
Right.
Okay, and then from Priscilla Naomi, she's asking, besides the use of fire, is there any other management activities going on these systems?
The wetland systems, a little bit of herbicide work where we've got evasives with the buckthorn, and in a small part of the refuge here, we've got the ability to control water levels, at least hold water back in our pool system, but that's it.
I guess we also need to mention, the Walsh Creek ditch has was put in, back in the teens or 20s or earlier, and has caused substantial drying along the ditch. And in fact, the peat is pretty dry right along the edge. It's pretty impressive. And within the past 7 years or so, there was a major project by the refuge to put in ditch plugs to try to redirect the water flow out of the Walsh ditch back into a more normal surface or subsurface flow across that. And so a number of those areas where the ditch plugs have held, efforts to restore the hydrology seem to be working. It's a slower process. It is killing out trees in some areas, but trying to restore hydrology is one of the other avenues the refuge has worked on.
I appreciate that. That's bad that I missed that. That's been a big project, and it's a big deal.
Yeah, and there's more that probably deserves to be done. Certainly in cruising around some of the remote areas of the refuge, especially the north central area where there is a lot of old diversion ditches and others, that there's quite a network of old ditches out there. Some of them have naturally degraded. The beavers are doing a wonderful job in other places, but there's still a lot of opportunities to address restoration of hydrology.
Okay. Steve Schumacher is asking when you will have the results.
We're working on the yellow rail data this winter. We've got all the data entered, and we'll be working on the results first for the yellow rails and their responses, but certainly knowing how data works and my reliance on the statisticians here, 1 to 2 years.
Okay, what were the dominant sedge species that you were dealing with? Larry Anderson is asking.
Yeah. Dominant sedge species are, forgive me because I'm using scientific names primarily, Lasiocarpa and Oligosperma. They're very fine sedges, and they, depending on which reference you use, they're usually wiregrass sedges. But they're fine sedges that actually are fairly hard to discern from one another at times. We had a lot of cordroot sedge. Dominant grass was the sedge blue, or the blue joint, Calamagrostis. The shrubs were primarily leatherleaf, especially down at Marsh Creek, and tag alder and bog birch.
Okay.
But we had probably, I think we're up to about 10 or more species of sedges we had in our sites.
Okay. Michael Peterson is asking, what was the percentage of the shrub component that you were targeting for removal, the desired remaining shrub percentage in sedge meadow?
We really didn't have a target. Again, we're trying to see if we could detect a threshold at which yellow rails left an area or weren't present in an area, and that's across the whole refuge, looking at the measurements of shrubs we did in those. So we're really just seeing, can we detect a change, not can we remove X% of shrubs in an area.
I think Mike's asking about the burn plan.
Ah.
And I can shoot a copy of that to you, Mike. The burn plans, this stuff is really hard to knock off the landscape. We target top kill is our language, and we're wanting to see about a 70% in the unit top kill. I think it was something like 40 to 70%, and we've been achieving that.
And further with that, Michael Peterson was also asking if there were burn restrictions during the yellow rail nesting seasons.
No. It's one of the things we recognize that in order to maintain the habitat in a condition that's healthy or preferred by a species, sometimes you have to burn during nesting seasons, whether it's for ducks or yellow rails. And it's very rare that you'll actually kill the adults outright. You may take out nests, and so that year's reproduction, but it is for the longer-term value of the habitat. So no burn restrictions by the refuge for relative to nesting season.
And the yellow rails tend to be off the nest. They're nesting during that kind of sweet spot when everything's really greening up, and we've got the most amount of water we're going to have for the year on the ground. That June period when we're going to fire training.
Yeah, and they'll probably be fledged by an August burn.
Okay, and then let's see. Jane, would your would your proposed remote sensing software evaluation work be conducted with Larry Strong? And Larry Anderson is asking this.
Probably not Larry Strong. He's pretty committed to another major project at this time.
Okay, and then Wayne Behringer is asking, are there any concerns with cattail taking over sedge meadows following fire? Is it less likely with late summer burns?
Cattail is definitely a challenging issue. It's interesting that at CNE, we actually have an old master's study that mapped cattail stands in the 60s in the major pool area, the eastern third of the refuge. And when you look at that mapped area versus where cattail are today, there doesn't appear to be any change. We do have scattered clumps of cattail. We have very few areas on the refuge that I'm aware of that it's really a dense stand as we see, especially out here in the prairies. And we suspect that we have, the system is just too nutrient poor and acidic to really have cattail, allow cattail to be dominant in the system.
Where you have cattails on this refuge, I'd say 7 out of 10 times, it's a safety zone. Fire won't move through it. There's that little, we don't have dense cattails for the most part.
Yeah, we certainly learned in walking these areas for the bird surveys that if you wanted to avoid going over your waders, you avoided cattail and burr reed patches. They tended to be either areas of upflow, subsurface flow up, so you had almost like a little fen, or a lot more water pressure, or definitely a much wetter, deeper conditions.
Okay. And Dave Pergolsky, is there a list of other threatened sensitive bird species that use these wetland sedges? If so, how can Dave get a copy of it?
I can certainly investigate that for you. I think those are the 3 main species that are considered threatened. Of course, it depends on your state, and in Canada they may have a somewhat different list. Yellow rails are the ones that is most highlighted. Actually, most of the work on Conte Sparrow, even though we found them in many places across the sedge meadows at Seney, most of the research on Conte Sparrows has been done in wet prairies and dry prairie grasslands. But I think the primary bird species are those 3, but I can certainly check out and get back to you.
Okay, and then Rick Witzke, what are your plans for the next 5 to 10 years, and do you have any phragmites yet?
Any what?
Phragmites?
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 Our plans for the future are going to be dictated by funding, and that's a whole can of worms right now. I can tell you the way the funding's going, we're moving. It looks like it's going to push us to move to the periphery of the refuge and focus on hardcore woolly issues. And that's about all I want to say on that right now. Phragmites, we've got some, just a little bit, and from what I understand, I think that's native. It's not an issue.
Yeah, it was really interesting in looking through, well, one, we had no Phragmites in any of our study areas. I think there's very little on the refuge at all. The other one of interest is reed canary grass, and there's, I think, only one small area in the refuge that has a stand of reed canary grass. And Dave and I, in looking through some of the refuge histories, refuge narratives are wonderful places to learn, that the reed canary grass is only in an area that once was drained and cultivated to provide green forage for Canada geese in the 60s. But no frag. Or very limited frag, I should say, probably.
I'm trying to think where there's a patch, and it's not an issue for us yet.
Yeah. Again, I suspect it's the low nutrient conditions and the acidity of the system, because we're on the edge of bogs in a lot of cases, and high iron contents.
And that's all I've got for questions. So.
All right. Well, thank you all, and hope this has been worthwhile for you.
And thank you, Gary and Jane, and you could hand the presenter over to me or just end it. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording now.